The Lady by Lalla Romano, 1948. In the hotel dining room, the lady started to observe the gentleman seated at the table across from her, and upon preliminary inspection surmised that he was interesting. The essential thing, that is to say, the hands were perfect. The lady never gave a second thought to men who had rough, neglected hands. The man at the opposite table took excellent care of his hands. They were slender, anxious hands, and the noble curve of the nails was free of impurities. His hair was smooth, grey at the temples, and moulded to his round, rather small head. As the lady factored each new element into her analysis, approval mounted in her heart, and her whole being was poised for happiness. The gentleman had finished lunch without raising his head, so the lady hadn't been able to catch his eye. He got up and left the room, not only without glancing at the lady, but without even a nod. For a moment, the morsel of food that the lady had just swallowed stuck in her throat, but she hastened to think that maybe she'd been mistaken, and then she abandoned herself to pleasant daydreams, looking out the window at the slope of the mountain where small fields of rye seemed to be fleeing below steady gusts of wind. Someone brought the lady a note. The lady had been waiting for it because she hadn't seen Nicola Rossi when she'd arrived on the morning coach. Nicola Rossi apologised for not being there and invited the lady to come up to his hotel. Nicola Rossi was a music critic and a friend of the lady's husband. The whole afternoon, Nicola Rossi talked about the stomach ailment that had kept him from coming to meet her. It was the altitude that gave him this trouble, and unfortunately, the pharmacy in town didn't carry effective remedies. Nicola Rossi talked about nothing else all afternoon, and in the evening, the lady was grateful to the man at the opposite table for being there. After 3 days, the lady had only managed to make eye contact with the man 2 or 3 times, though she hadn't been able to hold his gaze for even an instant. Later, questioning herself about that look, which had made a distinct impression on her, the lady tried to discern some warmth in it, a flash of kindness or sensuality, but she doubted this had been the case. A certain restlessness began to take root in the lady's spirit, but it was still linked to a subtle joy, owed in part to the sheer difficulty of the undertaking, and yet the lady realised that this particular joy, or rather pleasant excitement, was growing much less spontaneous, so that she had to seek it out, provoke it, and so the joy was turning less vivid, maybe even a little insincere and false. On previous occasions, a unique quality of this joy was that the lady felt it precisely when she exchanged more or less neutral glances or words with the new individual in question. This time, though, the strangest thing was that she couldn't feel joy in the gentleman's presence. Meanwhile, she fell prey to an inexplicable embarrassment that could only be called shyness. That was the strangest thing. The lady was certain, however, that she would regain full control once she could speak. At this point, the lady burned with curiosity to know who the man was and what his profession might be. His anxious hands suggested a pianist or a surgeon. Inventing an excuse, the lady asked to see the hotel register, but all she learned was that the gentleman was 40 years old. The box for profession was left blank. The lady was irked that she'd written, on her part, set designer. She gave advice to her architect husband, so she now replaced it with painter, which struck her as less odd. She also regretted having put down her exact age, but she didn't dare correct it. Besides, compared to the gentleman, the lady was still quite young. The lady had just stood up from the table and was looking, leaning against the window, at the small fields of rye rippling in the wind. The gentleman was finishing his lunch, and the window was behind his back. Now and then, the lady looked away from the landscape and stared at the gentleman's neck, which wasn't rigid or straight, but pliant, like a boy's. It was impossible to detect cruelty in it. The gentleman stood up and, rather than head for the door as he usually did, turned towards the lady and, without saying a word, offered her a cigarette. The lady was both delighted and disturbed, as if she were a shy teenager, and the way the gentleman brought the lit match up to her cigarette felt like a small gesture of intimacy. It wasn't a real conversation, just a few words about the hotel, the location. Mulling over it later, the lady noted that a cue hadn't been lacking. In fact, the gentleman had provided one, and she regretted not having picked up on it. That evening in bed, for the 20th time, the lady repeated the morning's exchange, and with no trouble at all, she found infinite ways of starting up an interesting conversation. The gentleman had mentioned that the hotel manager had got married that very year, but it was only because his mother had died, and he needed a woman in the hotel. Otherwise, he would have remained a bachelor because he and the gentleman had similar thoughts about marriage. She could have asked him to elaborate on this topic, thus getting to know what he thought about women. On the other hand, the lady knew that it wasn't just the brevity of the gentleman's conversation that had disappointed her. She knew he had a lovely voice, but that his pronunciation was marred, betraying the fact that he spoke dialect. Above all, she knew it was too late. The moment of realizing that she'd been deceived, a moment she'd been through on other occasions, during which she'd always made a quick decision, was somehow already behind her, without ever having been reached. The lady began envisioning favourable scenarios, ranging from the adventurous to the catastrophic. For example, a fire at night in the little hotel, mayhem, people scrambling to escape. She remembered that similar fantasies had consoled her in childhood when she wanted to be noticed by an older classmate who paid her no attention. Back then, those imaginary disasters served as pretexts for rescues, heroic actions, feats of self-sacrifice. Whereas now they served as occasions for escaping in one's pyjamas, or wearing even less. The lady ended up falling asleep to these fantasies, and her dreams almost always picked up the cue, granting it unexpected developments. On her solitary walks, she avoided going to see Nicola Rossi, who was still stuck in his hotel with stomach troubles. The lady reflected at length on the fragmented escapades of her dreams. The dreams ended up creating some sort of complicity between herself and the gentleman, but they only managed to intrigue her further without ever instilling confidence in her, not only because she was aware of their one-sided nature, but because they weren't enough to convince her, even in an illusory way, of a change in the gentleman's attitude, since he'd always behaved, even in her dreams, implacably like himself. These dreams weren't lacking a more playful side, though what it meant escaped the lady, that may have represented a sort of unconscious revenge. One took place in the museum. When she was a little girl, the lady had visited a sculpture museum and had been quite taken by a statue of a male nude that didn't have the customary fig leaf over its sex. But the reason for her astonishment and the mild discomfort she felt wasn't because she'd seen what was usually hidden, but rather because it looked so small and slender compared to figures' stature. At the time, her knowledge of the subject was rather vague, and she wasn't precocious by nature. The matter had upset her unconsciously, and she had ended up forgetting the whole episode. In the dream, the statue appeared to her at night, in a garden that was very dense and dark. It was extremely tall, and the head was lost in the shadows. The lady recognized the statue and once again felt that same discomfort, though it was much stronger and more distressing. Her gaze hastened to the place that had upset her, but there was no trace of what she'd glimpsed back then. There was only the customary fig leaf. The lady knew it was the man in the hotel. In another dream, the man turned up in an even more obvious manner. The whole town was on fire, and a terrified crowd was fleeing to the mountains. The lady tarried because she was looking for someone. At this point, the gentleman entered the scene. He moved with long, slow strides, even though he was running. He ran fluidly, like someone filmed in slow motion. The lady immediately recognized the gentleman's legs, and their strange movements didn't surprise her because she was used to observing the gentleman when he got up from the table. She'd noticed that he had long, agile legs, like a boy, but that his stride was slow and pliant, almost springing at the knees. The embarrassing thing was that the gentleman was wearing a flowing white nightshirt, the kind the lady had never seen, other than perhaps in some silent comedy from her childhood. All of a sudden, the lady knew she was dreaming, and she took advantage of this to satisfy her curiosity. She approached the gentleman and extended her hand, with the intention of lifting up the flowing gown, but just as she did this, she woke up, or at least, that was the part of the dream she remembered. There was a second conversation. The gentleman said he was waiting for a friend to arrive to go up the glacier. This conversation was also very brief, but it didn't end like the earlier one, because the gentleman didn't leave. Instead, something else happened. The lady and the gentleman were seated across from each other, close to their usual window. All of a sudden, even before finishing his cigarette, the gentleman leaned his head against the window jamb and closed his eyes. The lady wasn't offended, but she felt her heart clench in a brief burst of anguish. She looked at the gentleman's face, nobly agitated even in sleep, and felt like crying. Then she turned towards the mountain, where the familiar fields of rye rippled in the wind like small lakes in a storm. The gentleman really was sleeping, but he soon roused himself and said that in order to sleep well, one needed to go and lie out on a meadow, under the sun. The lady went to change and get a dressing gown. She put on her shorts and didn't forget to bring a book, because she assumed, though she was rushing, that nothing would happen. The lady climbed up a path behind the hotel until she reached a small meadow hemmed by the shadow of a beech forest. She opened her dressing gown on the grass, and she had just lain back when the gentleman reached her, then went on ahead, working his way through the bushes, perhaps in search of another meadow higher up. The lady was grateful that the sun was hot. A good deal of time passed. The shade of the beech trees reached the lady, and she started to shiver. The sun already looked sad above the snowcaps. She heard the sound of shifting stones. The man was slowly coming down the path. The lady looked at his naked torso. On the thin side, graceful. Without thinking, she impulsively said hello. The gentleman stopped, and the lady thought he was looking at her legs. As she saw him blushing discreetly below his tan, she felt no pleasure, just a sharp sense of shame. She stood and picked up her dressing gown. In the evening, the seat across from the gentleman was occupied. A large man dressed in brown corduroy, with his back to the lady, prevented her from gazing at her idol and intercepting his distracted glances. Through the window, above the man's massive shoulders, the lady no longer saw the neighbouring mountain, only a pink blade of sunlight about to be extinguished on the patches of snow on the facing valley. After lunch, the new man introduced himself. He was friendly and had big, stubby, good-natured hands. With him was his 18-year-old son. The lady went up to her room and chose, from among her dresses, a white evening gown she'd set aside the first day, deeming it inappropriate for that sort of hotel. It was a dress that exposed her shoulders to be worn with a short red velvet cape. The lady put it on and changed her hairstyle, gathering it at the top of her head with little combs. She applied her makeup carefully, then went back down to the room. No one paid attention to her. The small group was gathered around the radio, dominated by a giant man, the chief technician of the power plant, who was in charge of making the device work. The friend's son started staring persistently at the lady and then, encouraged by a nod, asked if she liked the music and invited her to dance. The large friend winked over at them now and then, and the gentleman was deep in conversation with him. Between dances, the lady could hear the man's voice and the unpleasant inflection of his dialect. She realized at a certain point that she could hear what they were saying, and she started listening. The lady's husband was a leftist intellectual, as were Nicola Rossi and all the lady's friends. The conversation the gentleman and his friend were having was unbelievably reactionary, especially on the part of the gentleman, while the friend seemed less convinced and, above all, less rabid. The chief technician also joined the conversation and, to the lady's astonishment, loudly proclaimed his opinions, which were even more backward. Since she was obviously following their conversation, the lady was questioned. She tried to respond in kind and felt strange pleasure at the thought that none of her friends was there to witness her degradation. During a pause, the gentleman started to study the lady's sandals, then praised them soberly. The lady felt acute pleasure, but was also embarrassed as always, and she then observed in turn the gentleman's shoes. The gentleman's shoes were marvellous. They were made of white suede with raised spirals in brown. The lady expressed her amazement and her admiration, and thus, for the first time, she saw the gentleman smile unabashedly. At that point, the friend said that if the gentleman didn't have beautiful shoes, who would, given that he made them? The gentleman clarified that he worked in leather, cutting uppers, and gave the lady some advice about buying shoes. Though she suffered, the lady didn't feel anything close to spite or rancour towards the gentleman, and she didn't despise herself either. In truth, she was so consumed by passion that she didn't have time to dwell on peripheral feelings. She knew nothing would happen, and yet she experienced the anguished sensation, though not entirely disheartening, of risk, as if she were walking on the edge of an abyss. She had the great clairvoyance to sense that, for the first time in her life, something terrible had been born inside of her, no less strong for that, but destined inevitably to defeat her. So great was her revelation that it would forever alter and undermine her certainty, her every illusion. The lady even felt a vague self-respect, or rather, respect for what she recognized was happening inside her. She knew it wasn't a matter of a stubbornness, but something that went beyond vanity and pride. All her faculties were thus taut, in a state of useless expectation. The friend's presence was of no use to the lady. The son brought her flowers when he returned from his walks, and looking deep into her eyes, confided his disappointment in the immaturity of his classmates. The lady thought he was boring, but in those moments preferred him to Nicola Rossi and to anyone else. Nicola Rossi, meanwhile, still felled by his stomach troubles, decided to go back to the city, and the lady told him to tell her husband that she was bored. The gentleman and his friend had organised their trip to the glacier. The hotel manager, also a guide, was accompanying them. The boy pleaded with the lady to join them. The lady harboured no illusions of lending the least bit of substance to their adventure, but she couldn't help but daydream about this trip to the glacier and imagine endless scenarios. But she didn't make up her mind. The night before, in the hotel lobby, she saw ice axes, ropes, crampons. They needed to leave before dawn. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, the lady thought she heard a car. After an hour, since she couldn't get back to sleep, she got out of bed, thinking she'd go up the mountain on her own. But she found everyone in the lobby, with the ropes and crampons. No one said hello. The car that was supposed to take them up to the cable car hadn't come, and now they were waiting for the milk truck. The hotel manager surveyed the street and called them after half an hour. The milk truck was enormous, without side rails, and was already crammed with people sitting on milk canisters. The lady nodded yes when the guide called her, and this was how she let herself be hoisted onto the truck. Keeping balance on the truck was extremely difficult. The road snaked uphill, and as the truck rounded each turn, it would veer to one side. The villagers, with their baskets, were anchored to the vehicle, but the gentlemen, including the guide, were an endangered bunch, and they clutched the shoulders of older women who seemed to be made of stone. The lady, seated on a basket between two canisters, was the most stable, and she was already starting to forget about herself and about her affliction. She was intent on drinking in, at every turn, apparitions of the tall white mountain, continually swallowed up by the dark pine forests. But she was aware that the gentleman was close to her, looking uncomfortable, because he was searching with one hand for something to hold on to. She was quick to grab the hand. She glanced at him and saw, through the wind, that he, a bit embarrassed, was thanking her. As soon as she made contact with his hand, the lady experienced intense pleasure. The hand was smooth, dry, and warm, and it clasped her own only as a means of support. That was all. The lady knew he could give her nothing more. But rather than feeling the usual humiliation, she felt a calm sense of possession. That clasp, untethered from the ground, in the middle of the whirlwind of jolts, sharp turns, and the ghostly backdrop of the unfurling mountains, was closer to the deceptive intimacy of their encounters in her dreams as opposed to real contact. But even though, as in those dreams, it contained a precariousness and, above all, a sense of solitude, the warmth it gave off was real and comforting, almost familiar. When it was time to step down from the truck, she sensed that the gentleman hurried to pull back his hand. She had already dismissed him, in any case. A car accompanied her back to the hotel, where she found a telegram from her husband. She had just enough time to pack her bags and left on the afternoon coach.
La Signora, written in 1948, first published in the collection La Villeggiante, Einaudi, 1975.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Have you ever, met someone totally new and bam, your mind just starts scripting their whole life?
Oh, absolutely. It happens.
Well, that's exactly where we're starting today, really diving into the fascinating internal world of the lady in this story.
Right.
From that first moment, she sees this gentleman in her hotel dining room, notices his, quote, perfect hands,
Hmm.
and suddenly her approval mounted and her whole being was poised for happiness. Just like that.
Instant connection, or at least the idea of one.
Exactly. But then what happens when, the actual person starts bumping up against that intricate story you've already written in your head?
That's the core of it, isn't it?
Yeah. So our deep dive today is all about exploring the lady's, her projections, her daydreams, and her actual dreams, and seeing how they shaped her view, but also how reality kind of shattered them.
And what's so brilliant in the text is how it shows that dynamic play between expectation
Yeah.
and reality. It's right there from the start.
Oh.
Well, we see her building this detailed picture almost immediately. You mentioned the hands she's thinking. Maybe a pianist, a surgeon.
Yeah.
And then she even changes her own story, writing painter in the hotel register just to seem less odd.
Right. Trying to fit into the narrative she's created.
Exactly. Those are her first sort of spontaneous projections, the things feeding those initial pleasant daydreams.
Okay. So those daydreams are flying high, but then reality starts to creep in, doesn't it? What happens when he doesn't quite perform as scripted in her mind?
Well, that initial joy starts to fade. The text says it becomes less spontaneous, even feeling insincere and false.
Because he's not playing the part.
Precisely. The actual conversations they have, they're brief. His voice, she notices, has an unpleasant inflection of his dialect.
Ooh, okay. Not part of the fantasy.
Not at all. And worse, his politics are described as unbelievably reactionary. which is a massive clash with her own social circle.
Wow, okay. So the gap between the dream and the man is getting wider.
Much wider. And this is where it gets really interesting psychologically, I think.
Mm.
When reality lets us down, where does the mind go?
Retreats.
Often, yeah. And in her case, it's a retreat into really vivid, elaborate scenarios. She starts envisioning favorable scenarios,
Yeah.
anything from adventure to, well, catastrophe.
Like the hotel fire idea.
Exactly. That one echoes childhood fantasies,
Yeah.
being rescued. But now it's evolved.
Evolved how?
The fantasy shifts towards occasions for escaping in one's pajamas or wearing even less.
Ah, okay. So these are more deliberate fantasies now, feeding unfulfilled desires.
Absolutely, it's an outlet. But then, these conscious daydreams, they actually start to influence her actual dreams at night.
Right. The text says her dreams almost always picked up the cue. But here's the key thing I found interesting. Do the dreams just give her what she wants? Does she finally get the fantasy version of him?
Well, that's the crucial part, no. Unlike her daydreams where she could script things, her dreams don't fundamentally change him.
He stays himself.
He always behaved, even in her dreams, implacably like himself. Which is fascinating, isn't it? Her subconscious knows him perhaps better than her conscious mind wants to admit.
So tell me about the museum dream then. How does that fit in?
Okay, the museum dream. She remembers being a child, seeing a nude statue, and feeling just mild discomfort because it seems small.
Okay.
But in the dream, the statue is suddenly extremely tall. It is the customary fig leaves, but her feeling isn't mild anymore. It's much stronger and more distressing.
And she knows it's him.
She knows it was the man in the hotel. So the dream isn't wish fulfillment. It takes a memory, connects it to him, and instead of making things clearer, it actually obscures him behind the fig leaf while amplifying her unease. It's like her subconscious is waving a red flag.
That's quite powerful. And the fire dream, it builds on the daydream, right?
Does. Town's on fire. She's looking for someone, presumably him, and he appears, but in slow motion, wearing this embarrassing flowing white nightshirt.
Almost ridiculous.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And she knows she's dreaming. She even tries to interact, to lift up the flowing gown, maybe just see the reality underneath.
But she wakes up.
She wakes up. It's this mix of wanting to uncover the truth of him, but also maybe confronting the absurdity or the ultimate elusiveness of the man she's built up.
So connecting all this, the daydreams, the dreams, the disappointing reality, what's the bigger picture here?
I think the dreams show this unconscious battle she's having. She desires connection, intimacy, but she's grappling with his implacable nature, the fact that he isn't the fantasy.
And that moment on the truck when she actually holds his hand.
Yes, that real contact. She even notes it feels closer to the deceptive intimacy of their encounters in her dreams. It's a strange comparison, right?
Yeah, reality feeling like the dream.
But it does offer a real and comforting warmth, even as she has this clear realization he could give her nothing more.
That's the turning point.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
It's this powerful shift, moving from pure, sometimes frantic fantasy towards accepting a limited, maybe even disappointing reality. The projection finally hits a wall.
So wrapping this up, the lady's whole journey through these layers of daydreams and nighttime dreams, it really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
It shows how our minds build things up, how we project, how we sometimes distort things, and then how we eventually have to, well, deal with what's actually there.
It's a testament to the mind's power to create and yearn, but also its capacity for acceptance eventually.
Yeah, acceptance of what is.
Exactly. Her internal world, her imagination, it's incredibly rich, a place of escape. But ultimately, it also becomes this sort of crucible.
A crucible.
Yeah, where the self gets tested and maybe even refined against the hard edges of reality, not just against what we wish things were.
So, thinking about all that, what really stands out to you listening right now? How much do your own internal stories, your own projections, shape how you see the people and the world around you?
That's definitely something worth thinking about.
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.